A black plus-sized African billionaire woman was walking down the aisle, radiant in a gown of gold silk and African embroidery, to marry a Korean man. Makena Okoro's presence was thunder in slow motion. Her body was full, graceful, commanding, every step an echo of continents colliding. Behind her, for attendants lifted her gown's train like a royal procession. Before her stood Min-Jae Kim, his tuxedo crisp, his eyes glistening with disbelief. He had once told her, "If my love for you were a nation, it would have no borders." Today that love was being tested by both nations. A low murmur rippled through the audience as Makena's father refused to stand for the bridal march. Sitting stiffly in his igbada, Chief Okoro's eyes held both pride and quiet fury. "I raised a queen," he had said once, "but not for a man who bows to ancestors that don't speak our tongue." In the front row, Min-Jae's mother, Mrs. Kim, clutched her hanbok tightly. "How can a woman like her be your bride?" she had cried weeks earlier. "Look at her size, her color, her world. You are shaming our blood." But neither family's disapproval had stopped them. The priest's voice broke through the tension. "We are gathered here in love's defiance of borders and bias." Makena's eyes locked on Min-Jae's. Every word from the priest felt distant. What echoed in her heart were memories of how it all began, years ago, beneath an acacia tree in Mombasa. It was 2007, and the sea breeze carried the smell of salt and roasted maize. Makena had come to escape her business meetings and her mother's endless reminders that a woman of wealth must marry her equal. She sat alone on a beach, wrapped in a kaiten shawl, sketching a resort expansion on her tablet. That was when a soft voice interrupted. "Excuse me, ma'am. Is this seat taken?" She looked up to see a tall man with gentle eyes, camera slung around his neck. He bowed slightly Korean style and smiled nervously. "My name is Min-Jae Kim. I'm a researcher on African architecture." Makena chuckled. "African architecture? You came to the right beach, Mr. Kim." That was their first conversation, light, clumsy, innocent. But what grew from it was far from simple. Over the next weeks, they met often. He listened to her stories about business struggles and loneliness behind success. She listened to his dreams of building cultural bridges between continents. He admired her power. She admired his humility. Their friendship was quiet until one evening when the sky turned orange over the Indian Ocean. Makena, standing barefoot in the sand, said softly, "Min-Jae, do people in your country love like we do here?" He smiled. "Love is the same everywhere. Only people fear it differently." But love, in their worlds, came with storms. When Min-Jae wrote to his family about her, his father didn't respond for weeks. When he finally did, the letter was cold. "You were not raised to marry outside the clan. You bring shame, not honor. End this before it destroys us." Makena's mother wasn't kinder. "A Korean? What do you know about their ways? Their food, their ancestors? You'll die in silence in a strange land." But Makena wasn't a woman to yield. She had built empires from dust. And this love, to her, was another mountain to conquer. "I'm not marrying a race," she told her father. "I'm marrying a heart that listens." For a year, they fought through it, long letters, cultural misunderstandings, even a brief breakup when the pressure became too much. Yet fate had its own script. One rainy night in Seoul, years later, Makena landed unannounced. She found Min-Jae working late in a university lab. He turned, shocked, as she stood there, drenched, trembling, but smiling. "I'm tired of fighting the world," she whispered. "Let's build our own." He dropped to his knees, took off his pen ring, and slipped it on her finger. "Then let this world begin tonight." And so, standing at that altar now, as murmurs rose around them, Makena and Min-Jae smiled. The priest lifted his hand. "If anyone objects to this union, speak now." Silence fell. But then slowly Makena's father stood. The audience froze. He walked toward her, his agbada brushing the floor, his expression unreadable. The music stopped. Even the violinist lowered his bow. He reached Makena, looked into her eyes, and whispered, "You are stubborn like your mother. But I see now, love raised you higher than I ever could." Then he turned to Min-Jae and said, "Take care of her, or you'll face a father who crosses oceans." The hall erupted in applause. Mrs. Kim wept silently, clutching her chest as if her heart had finally surrendered. And that day, beneath a golden canopy of cultures, two hearts became one, and two continents began to heal. But little did anyone know, that was only the beginning. Because years later, when their children were grown, the world would demand of them another choice. Which world would they truly belong to, Africa or Korea? And that question would test everything their parents fought for. The morning sun in Nairobi painted the Okoro Kim mansion in gold, a house that was neither fully African nor entirely Korean. The scent of kimchi, mixed with jollof rice, drifted from the kitchen, a strange but beautiful marriage of flavors, much like the people who lived inside. Inside the living room, the laughter of children filled the air. June, the eldest, had inherited his mother's full cheeks and his father's curious eyes. Tae, the second boy, was quiet and artistic. The third son, had Makena's fire and a mind that questioned everything. And then there was Sarah, their only daughter, delicate in frame but fierce in spirit, a blend of her father's gentleness and her mother's unshakable pride. Makena stood by the window, watching them argue over which language to use during breakfast. "Appa, I said please pass the salt," shouted Un in English. Min-Jae laughed. "And I said say it in Korean." Makena turned, smiling, her robe flowing like a queen's. "In this house, we speak all tongues, because love doesn't choose one." Her words silenced them for a moment. June nodded with mock seriousness. "Then I'll speak in food language, because that's universal." Everyone burst into laughter. But behind those smiles, the couple knew that the outside world wasn't laughing. When Makena and Min-Jae moved permanently to Kenya after their wedding, their union had been both celebrated and mocked. Newspapers called them the billionaire and the foreigner. Others called them a symbol of progress. Yet many whispered what they wouldn't dare to say aloud, that it was unnatural, that it couldn't last. Even in the elite circles Makena belonged to, people looked at her differently. She could have had any African man, some women murmured. But she went for a man who can't even handle our food. Min-Jae faced his share of scorn too. Business partners in Seoul questioned his loyalty. "You've gone native," they said. "You think Africa will respect you? You're just her husband, not her equal." He bore it silently. He had learned early that silence was a stronger weapon than words. But sometimes at night, when Makena was asleep, he'd sit on the balcony and stare at the moon, the same moon that shone over both their homelands. "Why is love the thing people fear the most?" he whispered one night. Years passed. The children grew, black hair and brown skin, fluent in Korean, Swahili, and English. They attended the best schools, traveled between Seoul and Nairobi during holidays, and yet they were strangers in both worlds. One day, when June was 12, he came home from school crying. "What happened?" Makena asked, alarmed. He hesitated, then blurted, "A boy called me half something. He said I'm not really Korean or African, that I'm mixed confusion." Makena froze. The room fell silent. She knelt and lifted his chin. "June, look at me." His eyes were red. "Do you know what happens when two suns rise in the same sky?" she asked softly. He shook his head. "They make the world brighter. That's what you are, light from two suns. You belong to both, and neither can dim you." He sniffled, a small smile forming. "Two suns." "Yes," she said firmly. "Two suns. Never forget that." That phrase became a mantra in their home. Whenever the children faced prejudice, Makena reminded them, "You are children of two suns." But as the years deepened, even Love's house began to tremble under the weight of identity. Min-Jae wanted the children to study in South Korea, believing discipline and tradition would shape their character. Makena wanted them to grow in Africa, where freedom and heritage would strengthen their pride. Their conversations grew tense. "Makena," Min-Jae said one night, "they need structure, rules, direction." "And what do you think Africa is?" she replied, her voice low but sharp. "Chaos. My children will not grow up thinking they must look east to find greatness." "I didn't say that," he said, sighing. "I just want them to know both worlds." She turned away, staring at the portraits of their children. "Both worlds are already fighting inside them, Min-Jae. Don't make it worse." It was one of the rare moments silence between them wasn't peace, it was pain. The next summer, the family traveled to Seoul for Min-Jae's mother's 70th birthday. Makena dressed in an elegant hanbok tailored for her size, her head high, her pride unshaken. But when she entered the Kim family home, conversations stopped mid-sentence. The old women whispered in corners. Some looked at her with admiration, others with quiet disgust. During dinner, one of Min-Jae's uncles spoke. "It's good that you came back, Min-Jae," he said in Korean. "Maybe your children will learn to behave properly here. Africa makes people wild." Makena understood every word. She had been learning Korean for years, silently, patiently. She smiled politely and replied in perfect Korean. Africa did make us wild, uncle. It taught us to survive storms your world has never seen. The table went silent. Even the old man's chopsticks froze mid-air. Then, to everyone's surprise, Mrs. Kim, the same woman who once opposed their union, began to clap softly. My daughter, she said in a trembling voice, you have my son's heart, and now I see why. That night, as they walked home under the soul lights, Makena took Min-Jae's hand. Do you think we've finally been accepted? She asked. He smiled faintly. Not yet, but acceptance is slow magic. It takes time. By the time the family returned to Nairobi, the world was changing. Opportunities opened on both sides. Korea wanted their children for education and innovation. Africa wanted them for leadership and legacy. Governments called them symbols of modern unity. Journalists followed their lives like royalty. But what the cameras didn't capture were the late-night conversations at their dinner table. 4 children, now teenagers, arguing softly about the future. I want to live in Seoul, said Tae. There's order there. I want to stay in Africa, said Sarah. There's soul here. I want both, said June quietly, because both made me. And Makena watched them, realizing what she and Min-Jae had built was far bigger than marriage. They had built a bridge, but soon their children would have to decide which side to stand on. By the time the Okoro Kim children reached adulthood, their home had become more than a mansion. It was a museum of identity. On one wall hung a Korean folding screen painted with cranes and mountains. On another, a massive African mask carved from ebony wood. In every corner of that house, the fusion of 2 worlds whispered and argued quietly, just as their parents once had. But the older the children grew, the louder the whispers outside became. When the global economy shifted, both Korea and Kenya began calling. Makena, now one of Africa's most powerful women, had expanded her business empire into tech, agriculture, and real estate. Her name commanded boardrooms from Lagos to London. Meanwhile, Min-Jae had become a respected cultural ambassador, bridging trade and education between Asia and Africa. Their children, however, stood at a crossroads. Governments from both countries offered citizenship and privileges. Scholarships, inheritance rights, and positions of influence hung in the balance. But the law demanded a choice. You can only belong to one nation officially, Makena's lawyer had explained. The dual citizenship clause doesn't apply to children of this lineage. They must decide. Those words fell like thunder in the family's dining hall. That evening, as the sun sank behind the Ngong Hills, Makena gathered her family. The table was silent, the air thick with tension. My children, she began, her voice calm but heavy, the time has come to choose where your hearts belong. This isn't about money or power. It's about identity. Africa or Korea, you must each decide. Sarah's eyes glistened. Mama, why must the world always make us choose? You and Appa fought so hard to unite 2 sides. Why can't we keep both? Min-Jae reached across the table, his hand trembling slightly. Because, my daughter, the world isn't ready for those who live between its lines. June clenched his fists. That's not fair. You made us believe we could belong everywhere. Makena looked at him. You do, my son. But sometimes to change the world, you must first play by its rules. They sat in silence. Even the ticking wall clock sounded like a countdown. Later that night, June stepped out to the balcony where the stars floated above Nairobi like scattered diamonds. Sarah joined in quietly. You know what I think, she whispered. What? The world isn't asking us to choose. Our parents are. June turned to her, surprised. They built something beautiful, she continued, but now they're afraid it won't survive if we don't protect it the way they did. Maybe they don't trust that we can carry both worlds at once. June sighed. Maybe. Or maybe they just don't want us to get hurt. They stood there side by side, 2 faces that carried both Africa's warmth and Asia's calm. The wind rustled their hair, carrying distant music from the city, a fusion of drums and violins. The following week, the South Korean government invited the Okoro Kim family to Seoul to discuss the children's future. It was a grand affair. Journalists, politicians, and socialites gathered like vultures for spectacle. At the press conference, the minister smiled warmly at the cameras. The Okoro Kim children represent a bridge between 2 great nations, he announced. But bridges must stand on one foundation. We invite them to make Korea their home. Makena's face remained composed, but her heart boiled. When it was her turn to speak, she stood tall, African prints wrapped around her shoulders like armor. With due respect, minister, she began, her voice ringing through the hall. A bridge that stands on one side collapses. My children belong to both worlds. They should not have to cut one away to make the other proud. The next morning, Korean tabloids screamed. African billionaire challenges Korean citizenship law. They were a controversy. Back home, tensions grew between Makena and Min-Jae. I understand your pride, Min-Jae said softly one evening, but you've turned this into a political war. Makena's eyes flashed. And what would you have me do? Let them erase my children's heritage quietly. This isn't about erasure, he said gently. It's about survival. You fight with fire. I prefer to fight with patience. Makena laughed bitterly. And patience gave you what? Respect that only exists behind polite smiles. That cut him deeply. He stood there for a long moment, his silence screaming louder than any shout. When he finally spoke, his voice broke. Makena, sometimes love doesn't need to win. It just needs to endure. Then he walked out, leaving her trembling in the echo of his words. Weeks passed. The issue spiraled into international debate. The United Nations even mentioned their family as a case study in cultural integration. Protesters stood outside both embassies, waving flags and signs. Some said love has no borders. Others shouted protect our purity. Sarah watched it all from her bedroom window, her heart splitting in two. Why can't people see that we are not a problem to be solved? She whispered to herself. One night, she gathered her brothers in the garden. The moon was full, washing their faces in silver light. We can't keep letting them fight for us, she said firmly. We have to decide, not for them, not for countries, but for ourselves. Un frowned. And how do we do that? Sarah smiled sadly. By choosing what we can give, not what we can gain. Her words sank deep into them all. Days later, they announced their decision, privately, to their parents first. June chose Korea, saying he wanted to prove that a mixed child could redefine what it meant to be Korean. Un chose Africa, declaring he would build companies that empowered rural youth, like his mother once did. Tae, the quiet artist, chose no country at all. He said his art belonged to the world. And Sarah, the youngest, smiled and said, I choose both. And I'll spend my life proving the world wrong. Makena wept silently. Min-Jae held her hand, whispering, see? They are wiser than us. She nodded. Children of two sons, and now, each has chosen their sky. But even as peace settled momentarily, fate had one more storm to send. Because just when their family found balance, tragedy struck, one that would test the strength of their love all over again. A phone call came one night. Min-Jae answered, and his face went pale. What is it? Makena asked, rushing to him. He turned slowly, tears forming in his eyes. It's June, he whispered. There's been an accident in Seoul. Makena's scream pierced the house, a sound of a mother whose world had just cracked open. The rain in Seoul that night refused to stop. It poured like grief that had lost its language, washing the streets with silver tears. Hospitals in the city were flooded with patients from a highway collision, and among them was Jun Kim Okoro, the eldest son of the woman Africa called the Golden Billionaire, and the man Korea hailed as the Bridge Maker. Makena and Min-Jae arrived at Seoul National Hospital before dawn. The smell of antiseptic filled the air, sharp and merciless. The fluorescent lights burned too brightly for a night meant for sorrow. Makena's heart pounded as she saw her son through the glass wall, pale, still, machines breathing for him. Tubes ran across his chest, monitors blinked, and doctors whispered to one another in Korean. Is he alive? She demanded. Tell me my son is alive. A nurse hesitated, glancing nervously at Min-Jae. He's in a coma, madam. The impact was severe, internal bleeding, skull fracture. He was driving home from university when a drunk driver ran the light. Makena gripped the glass until her knuckles whitened. Her son, her first child, her pride, the bridge between her two worlds, was now lying between life and death. Min-Jae took her trembling hand. He's strong, Makena. He has your blood. Her eyes filled with tears. And your patience. God, don't let him die. The news spread across both continents like wildfire. Africa mourned. Makena's first son fighting for his life in Seoul read the headlines. Business associates, leaders, and church groups flooded her inbox with prayers and condolences. Korea watched. Half African youth in critical condition. The tabloids wrote, their tone cautious, as if unsure how to frame him. Not fully theirs, but not foreign either. And amidst the chaos, the whispers returned. Maybe he should have stayed in Africa, one Korean news anchor said quietly. He was chasing belonging, replied another. Now he's found tragedy. Back in the hospital, Makena barely left his bedside. She fed him with her words, stories of home, of laughter, of childhood mischief. She sang in Swahili, whispered prayers in Igbo, and recited Korean proverbs she had learned for moments like this. Jun, she whispered, stroking his hair, wake up, my son. Your mother crossed oceans for you. Don't leave me here between them. Min-Jae sat beside her, silent, his hands clasped. He didn't pray aloud, he simply watched, his eyes raw from sleeplessness. He'd always believed that silence could heal. But now, silence was unbearable. Days turned into weeks. Doctors began to lose hope. We've done everything possible, one said softly. If he doesn't respond soon, we may have to consider. Makena cut him off sharply. You will consider nothing until my son wakes up. But inside, her strength was breaking. One night, she went to the hospital chapel, small, empty, filled with candles flickering like dying stars. She fell to her knees. God, she cried, you gave me everything, wealth, fame, even love, that defied the world. But if you take my son, then take it all. Let my empire crumble, but leave me my child. Her sobs echoed off the walls. Behind her, footsteps approached softly. It was Mrs. Kim, Min-Jae's mother, dressed in black. For a moment, neither spoke. The air between them was heavy with old wounds. Then the old woman said quietly, I once thought your color would bring shame to my family. But now I see, is your strength that keeps it standing. Makena turned, startled. Mrs. Kim knelt beside her. If prayers could trade lives, I would give mine for his. You are not just my daughter-in-law. You are the mother of my grandson. Let us pray together. For the first time, they held hands, black and pale, trembling but united. And as they prayed, something shifted, a quiet miracle of hearts, even before the miracle of healing. Meanwhile, in Africa, the rest of the Okoro Kim children followed every update. Sarah, now in university, refused to eat. Un organized prayer vigils in Nairobi. Tae, the artist, painted Jun's portrait, half of it in shadow, half in light, and titled it Two Suns Waiting to Rise. That painting went viral online. It appeared in newspapers, on television, in embassies. People began to talk differently. Maybe it's not about choosing sides, one commentator said. Maybe it's about existing in between, like Jun. For once, the world began to soften. Then one night, after 47 days in a coma, Jun's fingers moved. Min-Jae was asleep on the couch when the nurse burst into the room. He's responding. Makena rushed to the bedside, heart pounding. Jun, she cried, tears flooding her face. It's Mama. I'm here. His eyes fluttered open slowly, confused by the light. He looked around, lips dry and trembling. Where am I? You're home, she whispered. You're safe. He stared at her, and then at his father, before whispering weakly, Papa. Mama, did I make the right choice? Min-Jae smiled through tears. You made the only choice that mattered to live. The doctors called it a miracle. The media called it fate. But Makena called it mercy. After his recovery, Jun's story became a symbol across nations. Korean students held rallies demanding cultural inclusion laws. African organizations honored Makena for her resilience. Even the Korean president invited the family for a private dinner. During the ceremony, the president said, Your family story has reminded us all, love is not a color, and identity is not a border. But to Makena, the greatest moment came weeks later, when Jun stood before an international youth summit and spoke publicly for the first time since his accident. I used to think I needed to choose, he began. But now I see, I don't have to fit in one world. I was born to connect them. My mother taught me courage, my father taught me patience. I carry two histories, and I'll honor both. The audience stood, clapping and weeping. And somewhere in the crowd, Makena leaned against Min-Jae's shoulder, whispering, We did it. Our son has become the bridge we dreamed of. He kissed her forehead. No, he said softly. We all became the bridge. That night, the family gathered by the Han River, watching fireworks light the sky. Sarah leaned her head on her mother's shoulder. Mama, she said, you think the world will ever stop caring about where we belong? Makena smiled faintly. Maybe not. But as long as we keep loving, we'll keep proving that belonging isn't given, it's built. They stood there, the five of them, one family, one miracle, two nations under one sky. But destiny, as always, had another test waiting, one that would force their love to face its greatest challenge yet. Because when June returned to Africa, he carried a secret no one was prepared for.